Good afternoon to everyone. I'd like to welcome all present and the viewing and listening public to this, the 19th meeting of the Committee on Land and Physical Infrastructure. I'm pleased to advise that this meeting is being broadcasted live on the Parliament's Channel 11, Radio 105.5 FM, and the Parliament's YouTube channel, ParlView. First of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Derup Timal, and I'm the chairman of the Joint Select Committee on Land and Physical Infrastructure. And I would now like to invite our committee members to please introduce themselves. Maybe we can go with those who are present here physically, and then we'll go to those who are joining online.
Good afternoon, everyone. Renuka Sagram Singh Suklal, member.
Good afternoon, everyone. Dr. Muhammad Yunus Ibrahim, member.
Members who are online of the committee.
Good afternoon, everyone. Barry Kadarat, member.
Good afternoon, everyone. Anil Roberts, member.
Good afternoon, everyone. Lisa Morris Julian, Vice Chairman.
Thank you very much, members. There are two other members of the committee. That's Member Kennedy Richards, who unfortunately is not with us as yet, and also Member Lynn Oberger, who sent his apologies. He will not be able to attend. The purpose of our meeting here today is to commence the committee's first public inquiry pursuant to its inquiry into the various measures in place to address the challenges of climate change in Trinidad and Tobago, with officials from the Ministry of Planning and Development, Ministry of Works and Transport, Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries, and the Environmental Management Authority, the Institute of Marine Affairs, and the University of the West Indies. I would like to announce the objectives of this particular inquiry. And we have three major objectives. First one being to assess the impact of climate change in Trinidad and Tobago. Second, to understand the challenges faced in treating with climate change. And thirdly, to examine the effectiveness of measures being taken to mitigate the impact of climate change. I would now like to ask the respective entities that I called out before for their introductions and opening remarks. So first, what we'll do, we'll have the introductions, and then I would invite each entity to give brief opening remarks as we begin our meeting here today. So first, we'll go with the Ministry of Planning and Development. If we can have the introductions, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mira Ramisa, and I'm the Acting Deputy Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Planning and Development. And I have the team with me here, and they will introduce themselves.
Good afternoon, everyone. Kishan Kumar Singh, Head of the Multilateral Environmental Agreements Unit of the Ministry of Planning and Development.
Good afternoon, everyone. Julius Smith, Environmental Biologist, Environmental Policy and Planning Division.
Good afternoon, everyone. Kerry Pariag, Acting Director, Town and Country Planning Division.
Good afternoon, all. Marlene Andrews, Acting Director, Planning Division.
Okay, thank you very much, members of the Ministry of Planning and Development. I'll now kindly request members of the Ministry of Works and Transport to please do their introductions.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Sonia Francis Yellow, Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Works and Transport.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Catherine Babu Durga. I'm the Acting Director of Drainage, Ministry of Works.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Don Rambaran. I am the Shoreline Management Specialist of the Coastal Protection Unit, Ministry of Works and Transport.
Good afternoon. I am MOWT Singh, Acting Director of Fisheries.
Good afternoon. Ian Philip, Program Director, PIO, Ministry of Works and Transport.
Great. Thank you very much, members of the Ministry of Works and Transport. We now go to the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries.
Pleasant good afternoon, everyone. I am Kumari Gulab Singh, the Acting Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Denny Dipchan Singh, Conservator of Forests, Forestry Division, Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Albada Bikam, Director of Research in the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Narissa Lucky. I am the Acting Director of Fisheries, Fisheries Division, Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries.
Thank you very much, Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries. We now go to the Environmental Management Authority.
Good afternoon, Chairman. I am Hayden Romano, Managing Director of the Environmental Management Authority.
Good afternoon. I am Xiomara Chen, a coordinator in the Strategy and Research Unit at the EMA.
Good afternoon, all. I am Nisha Ramsahai, coordinator in the Strategy and Research Unit at the EMA.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Giselle Joseph, Assistant Manager Technical Services with the Air and the Noise Unit at the EMA.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alisa, Project Manager at the EMA.
Thank you very much, representatives of the EMA. We now go to the Institute of Marine Affairs. Are you hearing us? Are you hearing us from the IMA? Okay, I know we were having problems with getting their audio during the technical briefing. Seems that it still hasn't been worked out. Okay, so we'll move from the IMA. Hopefully we'll get them on board soon, and I'll go to the University of the West Indies.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Professor Michelle Michael, Professor of Urban and Regional Planning, and I was also the coordinating lead author for the Small Islands chapter of the IPCC Working Group 2 report. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Ronald Rupnarain, a lecturer in the Faculty of Food and Agriculture, focused on disaster risk resilience, climate change, and sustainable land and water management. Thank you.
Afternoon, Aidan Farrell, lecturer of plant physiology and lead author of the IPCC chapter on food, also dealing with other landscape vegetation impacts. That's me.
Good afternoon. I'm Ricardo Clark, senior lecturer in physics, and particularly environmental physics, and deputy dean of graduate studies and research at the Faculty of Science and Technology, UE. Thank you.
Thank you very much, representatives of the University of the West Indies. All right, what we'll do, we'll continue with the meeting because the IMA has left, they're engaged in some testing right now. and hopefully they will be able to join us. So what I'll do, we'll ask of the different entities here today with us for your opening remarks, brief opening remarks. So we'll start off with the Ministry of Planning and Development. Ms. Ramesa.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon again, Chairman, and all members of the committee. Good afternoon to the listening and viewing audience as well. The Ministry of Planning and Development appreciates the opportunity to be involved in this meeting of the Joint Select Committee to discuss measures in place to address the challenge of climate change in Trinidad and Tobago. I would like to add that the ministry is in support of this process, as it is imperative to share information and together put forward recommendations and implement solutions that will take us further along the pathway to effective and sustainable management of the environment. It is indisputable that climate change is globally acknowledged as perhaps the greatest environmental threat facing the planet and all that inhabits it. Trinidad and Tobago, as a small island developing state, is particularly susceptible to the adverse impact of climate change. Climate change impacts every environmental resource, as well as important economic sectors such as agriculture, food production, human health, water resources, physical infrastructure, and consequently of our overall socioeconomic well-being. Islands such as ours, with heavily populated low-lying coastal areas, are uniquely vulnerable to the impact of climate change in terms of rising sea levels and increased exposure to extreme weather events. To this end, data-driven strategies and programs must be developed by all nations, including Trinidad and Tobago, to cope with these adverse impacts. From a policy perspective, the National Development Strategy 2016 to 2030, or Vision 2030, has placed the environment at the center of economic and social development and recognizes that sustaining development depends on a healthy environment and necessitates a comprehensive and well-coordinated system to tackle the many interconnected issues. In this regard, the National Climate Policy seeks to address, among other things, the impact of climate change, including sectoral vulnerability and mitigation potential in major carbon-emitting sectors. The Ministry of Planning and Development recognizes the need for bold and transformative approaches to deal with the climate change threat, from mitigating and adapting to accessing funding. We are being proactive in developing and revising the climate change policies and legislative framework, and is keeping abreast of international climate agreements. Recently, the ministry attended and participated in COP27, where Trinidad and Tobago was well represented by an intersectoral delegation. Accordingly, the Ministry of Planning and Development is appreciative of this committee has placed special emphasis on the issue of climate change. It provides the opportunity to share with you and the national community some of the key initiatives being undertaken by the ministry, and also to address the challenge of climate change. As well, the recommendations that we will garner from this committee meeting, and which we look forward to. In closing, I would like to express my sincerest thanks for this opportunity to provide these remarks and look forward to our dialogue this afternoon. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ramesa, for those remarks as we start off our meeting here today. I'd like to just kindly request Mrs. Frances Yearwood, the Permanent Secretary from the Ministry of Works and Transport, for a brief opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman. Once again, good afternoon, Chairman, colleagues, and academic associates from the Ministry of Planning and Development, Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries, the EMA, IMA, and the releases of the rest of these being published. The realities of a changing climate are manifesting in increasingly more frequent and extreme weather events, which have had widespread effects on the national economy. The Ministry of Works and Transport is keenly aware of the losses, disruption, and devastation brought about by such events in the lives of citizens. In this regard, the Ministry, its divisions, units, and agencies are continuously reviewing, reassessing, and updating its various plans, policies, procedures, and work programs under its collective purview to mitigate the impacts of climate change. The Ministry acknowledges that as a key stakeholder in the national response framework, that a great deal of collaboration and sharing of data, expertise, and resources is needed across all levels of society to address the multifaceted causes and impacts of climate change. To this end, my team and I stand ready to answer your questions to the best of our collective knowledge and expertise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Francis Yewood. I'd like to just go now to Ms. Kumari Gulab Singh, of the Acting Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thanks to the committee and its members, to the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Works and Transport, to the Deputy PS at the Ministry of Planning and Development, and all other stakeholders at this important meeting. I thank you all for being part of it. Climate change is one of the biggest environmental challenges facing the world. The need for urgent action to address climate change can only be achieved with clear and decisive actions towards the agricultural sector. These include reforestation, law enforcement, and sustainable agriculture practices. The agriculture sector faces the harsh impacts of climate change, which negatively affects food supplies and result in a loss of income and reduced livelihood for farmers. We are all aware of the incidence of flooding and its impact on our farmers and the population in general. In fiscal 2022, the ministry paid approximately $2.9 million as flood compensation to alleviate the effects of flooding on the farming population. Thus far, for fiscal 2023, $110,630 has been paid, and additional flood damage assessments are currently underway to determine compensation to approximately 1,340 farmers. To further mitigate against flooding, several infrastructure initiatives, namely rehabilitation of construction of sluice gates, installation of pumps, the desilting of water channels, are proposed for implementation at high-prone flooding areas such as Plumita, Orange Grove, Arangway South, and Felicity. Additionally, harsher, drier seasons increases the occurrence of forest fires, leading to deforestation. The impact of deforestation leads to a rapid runoff of rainwater, resulting in increased flooding. The Forestry Division of the ministry seeks to address the issues of deforestation through replanting exercises and prudent forest management techniques. The effects of climate change spans far and wide, from increasing temperatures to reduce food and water availability. If we are to implement targeted actions to address the impacts of climate change on the agriculture sector, access to accurate and verifiable data and information is critical. To this end, the ministry collaborated with the Ministry of Planning and Development to access funding from the Green Climate Fund for a recently conducted project improving the monitoring system for climate change impacts on the agriculture sector in Trinidad and Tobago. This project allowed for the development of the Trinidad and Tobago Agri-Climate Information System, which will allow for the collection and analysis of agricultural, hydrological, and meteorological data, and for the visualization and reporting of climate impacts on the agriculture food system. The ministry is also cognizant of its role in fulfilling the objectives of international conventions regarding climate change, such as the International Treaty of Plant Genetic Research for Food and Agriculture. The main objectives being the conservation and sustainable use of all plant genetic resource for food and agriculture, and the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of their use, in harmony with the Convention of Biological Diversity for Sustainable Agriculture and Food Safety. Further, the ministry has participated in climate change projects as the climate change adaptation in the Eastern Caribbean fisheries sector project. There were notable improvements in the fishery sector as the objective of this project was met to increase resilience and reduce vulnerability to climate change impacts in the Eastern Caribbean fishery sector through capacity building exercises to ensure safety at sea. I wish to conclude that the ministry will continue to address the impacts of climate change through improved policy decisions, proactive infrastructure measures, and enhanced reforestation programs. Thank you, Chair.
Sorry, I think my mic was switched off. Thank you, Ms. Gulab Singh, for your remarks. I would like to kindly request Mr. Hayden Romano, Managing Director of EMA, for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Chair, members of the committee, colleagues. Climate change is an urgent and irreversible threat to societies and the planet. This is especially critical for small island developing states like us in Trinidad and Tobago. We at the Environmental Management Authority are very pleased to participate in this inquiry, and we look forward to the remainder of this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Romano. Now go to Professor Michelle Maiku of the University of the West Indies. Professor.
Thank you, Chair. The University of the West Indies is very much committed to excellence in teaching, research, and collaboration that informs policy formulation, advances advocacy, and facilitates a Caribbean climate smart and resilient zone, and also within the context of Trinidad and Tobago. Our campus is engaged in climate change research in several thematic areas, including adaptation as it relates to land and infrastructure. And there are multiple thematic areas that our colleagues at the UWI are engaged in terms of research output. They include agriculture and food security, the blue economy, the green economy, disaster risk reduction, renewable energy, water security, and of course, the use of digital technology in examining impacts as well as finding innovative solutions to the the challenges of climate change that we are facing. The University of the West Indies stands ready to provide thought leadership and advocacy to advance the implementation of climate smart and resilient human development, all within the context of achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals within Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Michael. The IMA, I'm glad to report, is back with us. So I would like to ask the IMA first to do your introductions, and then if we can have your opening remarks. So we go now to the IMA, Institute of Marine Affairs.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Rahana Juman, and I'm currently the Acting Director at the Institute of Marine Affairs.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Khalil Hassan Ali, and I'm a Research Officer in Policy at the Institute of Marine Affairs.
Good day, I'm Alicia Carter-Fisher, Chief Information Officer.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair. The Institute of Marine Affairs is a multidisciplinary marine research organization established to conduct interdisciplinary research. Our mandate is to collect, analyze, and disseminate data and information related to the economic, technological, environmental, social, and legal development in marine affairs generally, and to formulate and implement specific programs, projects to achieve its overall objective. Basically, we conduct and foster research and provide advice to support the sustainable management of the coastal and marine area and resources of Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago being a small island developing state where most of our population and our economic activities are located along the coast, and we relying very much on our marine ecosystem to support our lives and livelihood. IMA, of course, conducts research in this area. Our mandate or our vision, of course, in terms of our research is to strengthen the science policy nexus by conducting applied research on the coastal and marine environment to assist with effective decision-making towards achieving sustainable development, and of course, to produce knowledge product for public education and awareness. So in terms of climate change, we conduct and apply innovative research related to climate change impacts and adaptation, as well as looking at other impacts on our coastal and marine environment, and of course make that our research available for decision-making, not only by policymakers, but also by the public. So we have a very vibrant public education and awareness program as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Juman. So at this point, we would commence questioning from the reps from the various entities by members of the committee. Now, I would just like to remind both committee members and officials to please direct your questions and concerns through the chair, and also to remind members and officials that please keep your microphones muted until recognized by me, the chair. And if you can utilize the raise hand feature, should you want to contribute to the discussion that is taking place. I will now open the floor to members of the committee to ask questions. And to start us off, I would kindly request our member Morris Julian to ask a question, or questions, sorry.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Chairman, through you, Ministry of Planning and Development, I think in light of recent events that we have been experiencing with the flooding and the weather in Trinidad and Tobago, I think we could pay particular attention to climate change. Reference is made to the various studies regarding vulnerability to the impact of climate change in Trinidad and Tobago as outlined in your response. Could you please provide us the year the respective studies relate to?
Thank you, member. Thank you for your question. May I pass you on to our officers from the environmental unit.
Thank you, member, for the question. The reports mentioned is a culmination of a period of study that started in 2018, primarily among them the third national communication to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was completed and submitted to the UN in 2021. And that report basically looks at two aspects of climate change. One, the greenhouse gas emissions portfolio from a sector-based perspective, and two, the conduct of vulnerability analysis to climate change based on various scenarios that are modeled according to accepted modeling technology, and as well identify some of the intervention options that are necessary to adapt to the impacts of climate change. That's one part of the study. The other part is a vulnerability and capacity assessment that was done to assess the vulnerability to climate risks and the capacity to respond to those risks. There's a slight nuance and a slight difference, if you permit me to perhaps explain in a little bit more detail. The issue of climate change is that the impacts and the modeling go well into the future. And therefore, given the current rate of climate change is very uncertain because the emissions are rising globally, the impacts are intensifying, the models are being challenged, and therefore the approach to adaptation and vulnerability assessment is being done on two levels. One, with long-term adaptation in mind, but planning for that adaptation is being done through what is called a pathways approach. That is assessing the climate risks in the short to medium term and in composing or analyzing intervention options that could reduce those climate risks with a view to revisiting those risks as time goes by. So we build climate resiliency as we go forward. That was completed, I think, in 2015 or 2016 or somewhere thereabouts. I can't remember the exact date of it, but those are the two timeframes basically for those two respective studies and the content and the context in which they were conducted.
Thank you very much. Through you, Chairman. I thank you for the very comprehensive, so I didn't have to do any follow-up questions on that particular question. However, your submission identified areas, through you, Chair, most vulnerable to damage to access roads, major roads, transportation links, and to flash flood damages. The first question, what can be done to help the communities in these areas? Something must be able, from a planning perspective. Through you, Chair.
To respond. Thank you, member, for the question. The issue of climate change vulnerability and adaptation to those vulnerabilities and mitigating the risks requires very detailed analysis. So, for example, you would appreciate that the climate change vulnerability profile of a community like Kernahan or Cascado on the East Coast would be entirely different to a village in Paramin because of the topography, because of the various characteristics of the populations. So once we define the vulnerability profile based on the risks that they would be exposed to, then the intervention options can be identified. So, for example, the intervention options for at-risk communities on the East Coast, for example, those two communities that I mentioned, would entail a different set of policy approaches, technological approaches where they may be applicable. And same goes for other communities, whether they're on the coast or whether they're inland or whether they are prone to flooding, whether they are prone to drought. So the issue of developing climate risk profiles for vulnerability for communities especially will require very, very granular detail. And we had started that with the vulnerability the climate risk assessment that I mentioned. And let me quickly add that we have the intention of rolling out the recommendations that came out of that study. We had developed an implementation plan for the study as well as a financial investment plan for implementing the study because it will require some financial resources. That was scheduled to take place this year, but because of some resources, human resources, warm bodies, and as well a heavy meeting agenda, we have now postponed that to the first 6 months, at least the first half of next year, where we hope to engage regional corporations, ministries, agencies, divisions in looking at what the recommendations are, what the climate risk profiles are, how it applies to those ministries, divisions, what their roles and responsibilities would be, and how they can now incorporate and integrate the recommendations so that they can actually go on the ground and assess the situation within the respective mandates. And the idea is to really integrate and truly integrate these findings into the respective strategies, the respective PSIP projects, the respective policies of these various entities, be they ministries, divisions, or agencies. Because that is one of the challenges. One of the challenges is that we continue to operate in silos, whereas climate change has been recognized as a national development issue. And in order to build climate resiliency going forward, then all of government, all of nation approach is required, where every entity that has a responsibility for climate change resiliency needs to now integrate relevant policy, relevant plans, relevant studies that we would have conducted, because there can't be one super ministry to implement issues related to water resiliency, for example, or agricultural resiliency, for example. So the idea is, and the challenge has been, integrating and incorporating the recommendations of these studies, the policy into the various divisions and ministries, so that when the relevant entities begin to develop their strategies and their projects and their funding projects, for example, they can take into consideration aspects of climate change risks and climate change impacts in rolling out their respective work programs so that resiliency can be built over time. And this, of course, is an iterative process, as I said, because of the shifting long-term goalposts. And as a result, the need for that kind of integration and incorporation across ministries, across agencies, across divisions, with a true understanding of their roles and responsibilities, taking into account the issues and the related to climate change impacts, is really where the solution would lie. And that has been a challenge, if I could be permitted to perhaps identify some of those upfront. Thank you.
Through you, Chairman. Unfortunately, these issues are happening now. So I am a bit concerned when you spoke about a human resource issue. Could you just edify us a little bit more about the human resource and how that prohibited you from doing?
Sure, sorry. Thank you for the question. The responsibility for coordinating climate change policy and devising implementation plans lie within the Environmental Policy and Planning Division of the Ministry of Planning, and by extension, the Multilateral Environmental Agreements Unit. We had succeeded in developing the various plans, and we had planned to also begin rollout by engaging with the various entities through consultations on how these plans and the recommendations can be incorporated into the respective mandates. The issue of human resource is that we have a very small unit, and coordinating the rollout of that set of plans and recommendations has been a challenge, because we are also charged with coordinating international negotiations, for example, under the other various MEAs, such as the Basel Convention, the Rotterdam Convention, the Stockholm Convention, the Convention on Biodiversity, the Convention on Ozone Depleting Substances, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Paris Agreement, as well as the Convention to Combat Desertification. So that is the human resource issue that I referenced. But we are managing, as I said, and the plans are to begin those consultations and those engagements certainly in the first quarter of 2023. Thank you.
So through you, Chairman, are you saying that those issues should be resolved enough by the first quarter?
The plans will be rolled out in the first quarter. We are managing as well as we can with the existing human resource constraint, and I could probably add that we've been doing that very, very well through the diligence and the hardworking staff that we have here at the ministry. And it's just one of those issues where those plans to roll out the implementation plan of the VCA study clashed with other implementing plans for other issues related to some of the other MEAs. So it's just a matter of planning the rollout now, which we have sat down and considered, and we are targeting the first quarter of 2023 to roll out the VCA plan. Thank you.
Through you, Chairman. I am not by nature an alarmist, but I must admit I am alarmed because I would like to know what is being done to protect the communities in these areas, given that they're the most vulnerable to damage.
Yeah, thank you again for the question. Thank you again for the question. The responsibility of the Ministry of Planning and Development, and particularly the MEAU, as had been submitted in the responses, is to develop policies, to develop plans, to coordinate implementation, but the actual implementation of measures to address on-the-ground climate change impacts, of course, as you would appreciate, lie with various other ministries and agencies that have that core responsibility. And that is one of the challenges that I alluded to. Where there's a lack of coordination, there's still a siloed approach. And one of the ways in which we hope to transcend that and overcome those barriers is really the integration of these policies and plans into the respective mandates of the various agencies and ministries. And therefore, by integrating, I also mean that some of these ministries and agencies need to take ownership of the plans and policies. And that again has been one of the challenges, because we have done the studies as within our mandate. We have done the plans, we've made the recommendations. The recommendations now have to be implemented across the board, recognizing that there are nexuses and direct and indirect impacts from one sector onto the next. And therefore, ownership now needs to be taken by these relevant entities in implementing on the ground. And that is what I alluded to earlier when I said that it has to be integrated into the various policies and plans. And our limitation here at the ministry is that we're not an implementing ministry to actually do some of these on the ground implementation of the recommendations that came out of the study. So that is one of the challenges that we've had, and like I said, with the rollout and the consultations and the identification of roles and responsibilities, and the idea that these entities will take ownership of the recommendations and implement them is where we are going next. That is not to say that we have not identified before some of these roles and responsibilities in consultation with some of these entities. So I think a lot of that has already been documented. It's now, like I said, to actually take ownership and implement and develop some rollout strategies within these various entities to actually get on the ground the measures that are required to address the impacts of climate change. Thank you.
Through you, Chairman. So what are we hearing? We're hearing that there needs to be some sort of interministerial action committee, but the planning and development cannot implement. But however, they do have the information and they will supply it, as well as for the want of a better word, division of labor. Is that?
Well, yes and no. The efficacy of ministerial committees would be dependent on how effective ministries actually take ownership of the recommendations and implementing them.
So through your Chairman, it's an ownership. This is what I've been hearing throughout this, and I know my colleagues would have some concerns regarding that. But in an effort to move on, before I allow the Chairman, or rather the Chairman allows me, I just have a very important question. regarding the east-west corridor. We are now seeing areas that are not areas known for traditional flooding. And we would like to find out what is contributing to the flash flooding in these areas along the east-west corridor, as well as northwest Trinidad. Because it seems to us that planning has a very fair idea of where the problems lie. So if we could get some details about that, please, we would really appreciate it.
Yeah, Member Morris Julian, before I ask for the response to that particular question, I think before we move off the initial questioning that you have started,
yes, sure.
based on the response from Mr. Kumar Singh, there are certain things that are coming up that I would like to ask one or two things, and Member Sagar Suklal as well would like to ask. Mr. Kumar Singh, you had based on your response, right? And the mentioning of the siloed approach in terms of what has been taking place thus far. I mean, of course, you have been making a lot of attempts through the studies and the projects and all that has been taking place under the leadership of your unit to address the challenges as best as possible. But it appears to me that we are in a sort of vacuum, because in terms of pulling all of this together into actionable plans for implementation so that it directly impacts in the shortest term possible the respective communities that are subjected to all of these, the impacts of climate change. I mean, the member Morris Julian mentioned about the interministerial committee, but outside of that, you said about integrating the findings into the respective mandates of the respective stakeholders. But by the Ministry of Planning and Development doing that integration, to what extent of collaboration, to what extent of acceptance with the stakeholders are we looking at for it to become achievable? Because they have to buy in as well. They have to be resourced as well in order to take these things onto their mandate. Has your unit, has the ministry looked at any specific mechanism, any specific organizational possibilities that we could develop on, that this committee could probably recommend, you know, and give it further thought to come up with a mechanism that could really address this vacuum, this break the sectoral approach and get us into cross-sectoral approach, get us out of the siloed approach. Because to me, this is one of the biggest bugbears in the entire thing. Because we have all these studies, we have all the work being done. How are we going to translate it into actionable items that could have direct impact almost immediately on the communities that are being affected?
Thank you for the question, and an excellent one at that. Because that is one of the challenging things that we have to deal with in respect of how do we actionize and implement the plans and the recommendations. But first, let me start by saying that these plans themselves were not constructed or developed by the Ministry of Planning and Development. They involved all of the relevant entities that have a stake and a role and a responsibility in climate change, whether it's the water sector, the agricultural sector, tourism, health, industry. They have all been consulted, and actually the development of the vulnerability capacity assessment to climate risks actually involved the convening of technical working groups that involved all of these entities, so that they are quite aware and they had an input into the development of these plans. The biggest barrier, as you rightfully and correctly identified, is how do you now translate those recommendations and those plans into action? Again, ownership is one of the issues that need to be addressed. Otherwise, there is only the way of moral suasion from our perspective and coordination as far as possible, because the mandates of various entities are well entrenched in law or policy. But we have been looking at ways in which we can circumvent this, in addition to some proactive approach by the relevant entities to take ownership and to implement. And one way of doing that we have been toying with, and this is something that needs to be a little bit more ventilated internally, is seeking a mandate from Cabinet to mandate these various ministries and agencies and divisions to incorporate the recommendations, the plans, the actionable items that we have developed with their input as well, so that ownership could possibly be mandated, if I could use that perspective. And so that's one way of perhaps circumventing or surmounting the challenge of siloed approach and the lack of ownership. But at the end of the day, really integrating these recommendations and these plans, taking into consideration climate risks, climate impacts, and everything to do with climate change into the sector, in developing strategies, in developing PSIP projects, in looking for funding to develop grant funding projects, for example. That's the only way that in my view, my humble view, that the true integration of climate change as a national development issue can be implemented at all levels and really build climate resiliency going forward. So one of the things, like again to repeat, is the idea of getting a mandate at the highest level for these ministries, divisions, and entities to take ownership or to incorporate, integrate as far as possible into their relevant roles, responsibilities, and mandates the recommendations that have been developed, again with their input and consultation. So that's one way of that we are looking at. Thank you.
Chairman, if I may, I would like to add that the Ministry of Planning and Development has responsibility for the public sector investment program. And one of the criteria for allocating funding per project is that the project proposal must have an element of how it impacts the environment. So that is another way that we are using to ensure that projects and programs do understand its impact on the environment to the extent that it can cause damage or to the extent that it can be mitigated. And that's currently happening, but of course, more needs to be done. I would say it's at the very nascent stage, but it's something that we are doing. And the environment unit is also looking into mainstreaming environment in projects and programs, much like how we do gender and other areas. So those are other areas, apart from the cabinet mandate, those are some of the things that we are doing at the moment. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Ramisa. But I'm glad you raised it about the PSIP and the allocation of projects for the environment. But one of the things, if you look at budget allocations for the past maybe 4 to 5 years, you would recognize that for the PSIP, out of the 4 or 5 pillars, 4 of the 5 sustainable development goals that we aim for, the environment being one of it, only receives, and I know because I've checked this for the past budgets, only receive about 3 to 4%, if so much, of the overall PSIP. So yes, I acknowledge what you're saying, and it's a start. But I've always wondered why so little allocation under the PSIP is made for the environmental projects.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, it would appear when you do the categorization, it would appear as though the environment pillar is receiving a small amount, but when you take into consideration that climate change related projects, so for example, drainage and the Ministry of Agriculture would have some projects as well. So because those projects are farmed out in the other pillars, they may not be reflected in the environment pillar. And which is what Mr. Kumar Singh was speaking about, because these projects are integrated and they cross many ministries and many sectors. It would be a little difficult to see the total amount if we just look at the environment pillar. So that is a gap that we would be addressing going forward to ensure that we are able to say definitively what is the amount of money is going towards environmental related projects. So it may not necessarily be in that pillar, but it would fall under other pillars as well. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
But it's one of the recommendations we'll take going forward.
Yeah, I would really like to see you all relook at that allocation for the environment. I understand the point you're making, that it's integrated with the other pillars. But remember, those other pillars also receive, outside of PSIP, they receive funding as well, additional funding. It's just, to me, it's a bit skewed at the moment, seeing that we are in the stage of implementation, actionable items coming out of all of these studies and policies and everything. And I see the need to really accelerate, this aspect of it. But before I go to Member Sagram Singh Suklal, coming back to what Mr. Kumar was saying, and Member Morris Julian did make the point about an interministerial committee. I would just like to get the views of your team there. In terms of, do you think for the short term, as a catalyst and as to create a immediate focal point to catalyze the entire thing, to address the siloed approach, to get things moving, that there is merit to a special task force being set up to look in depth at this particular challenge that we have before us. And also, in addition to using the resources from the ministries, the respective ministries, that task force could incorporate the private sector participation and also participation from the academia, because we have representatives from UWI here. And we heard Professor Michael mention about the work that the university is doing as well. And if by that coming together of private sector, public sector, academia, into a special unit, could be a short-term unit, but just to bring all of this together to the fore and to chart a way forward so that we can really get this thing moving. Your thoughts?
I do agree that a coordinating entity is needed. We do have many examples of coordinating committees, etc., but we really need to emphasize that it needs to be a serious effort. We need to look at the level of the representatives, the persons who can actually make decisions. We need to have persons who are really intimately involved with the issues, who can give, expert advice. And we really need to have people who, I want to emphasize again, who are serious, who will attend meetings, who will see the climate change coordinating entity as a priority. Because many times we start off and it will probably just, fritter out. So yes, fizzle, sorry, my colleague is correcting me. So those are some of the challenges we have had with coordinating entities. But if we have to deal with the silo challenge, it's probably the main way to go. I would like to ask Mr. Kumar Singh to add anything if he because he's on the ground, so he can speak.
Thank you. Just to support that intervention, maybe a little story might help. 25 years ago, I used to chair the National Climate Change Committee, which had representation from most divisions and ministries. And from it came a lot of recommendations, policy recommendations, and so on. And it remained just that, policy recommendations. While the idea to set up a task force, I think, is a good one, I just want to flag that recommendations coming out of the task force could very well risk being just recommendations. And unless there is some guarantee, either in law or policy, that the recommendations will be incorporated and integrated, then I just want to flag the limitations of committees and task forces, if that's the plural, in devising strategies to deal with not only climate change, but perhaps more than one environmental issue. So part of the realization that we've had over the years is that, for example, and let me use this example as an illustrative example because it's live, compiling our greenhouse gas inventory. When we did this, when I coordinated this 25 years ago, 1997, 1998, we couldn't get data. No matter how much letters we wrote, how much persuasion we asked of entities in custody of the relevant data, we couldn't get it. That was the first report in 1998. The second report 10 years later, the same thing happened. We just finished the third report, and we've had better responses. But one of the things that we have recognized is that mere requests are not necessarily complied with. So we have developed, the first in the region, I should add, a monitoring, reporting, and verification system, which we have developed and is now being managed and housed at the Environmental Management Authority. And we have engaged stakeholders to the extent that they are now voluntarily providing data that will allow us to, with some level of confidence, compile our national greenhouse gas inventories. But more than that, because we have now commitments under the Paris Agreement to account for internationally, we have to track the achievement of our commitments. And one of the recommendations that came up during consultations of how this can be tightened up actually was to put the MRV system into law. And that recommendation has been taken up. A consultant was hired. The draft is already there. The legal draft is already there. And at this point, I don't want to speak for the EMA, but we are awaiting technical drafting instructions from the EMA to incorporate this requirement, this mandatory requirement that will now be a legal requirement for submitting data to compile our greenhouse gas inventories. Once that gets into law, then it will be the first of its kind in the region and perhaps among the few in the world. And that could be used as a pilot that can then be modeled for the submission of other types of data, for example, to really develop the kind of plans. But going back to the same issue of the siloed approach, while committees work, they are only as good as the implementation of the recommendations that come from those committees. And it comes back again to the siloed approach and the real ownership that really needs to be taken to implement this important issue. I think if climate change is not being treated as a real threat, I think there are some people who still believe that it's something that is not happening or something ahead of us by a few decades, while it is really upon us. We are seeing the impacts.
Not after the events of the last few weeks.
I agree totally. And if there's anything good in any of the bad events, I think that realization is something that now has to be brought home to every sector, to every ministry, to every division, so that real ownership can be taken of what needs to be done and what needs to be implemented on the ground. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Member Sagram Singh Sukla.
Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to make a very brief intervention. So much of the conversation this morning, of course, is about stakeholders, all hands being on deck approach. Of course, my respectful submission, Chair, is that one critical stakeholder, of course, will be NGOs and NPOs, especially springboarding off of the comment that Member Morris Julian made relative to communities, specific communities being affected, and what projects and what the ministry had intended to do to treat specifically with some of those communities. Now, why I brought up the issue of NGOs and NPOs is because many times you'd find that these NGOs and NPOs operate in communities, sometimes very much the vulnerable communities. And I believe that they are critical, of course, in this climate change conversation. Now, part of the conversation this morning was also about taking ownership. Respectfully, Chair, through you, the Green Climate Fund is something that falls under the purview of the Ministry of Planning and Development. So in the conversation of ownership, what of course, I'm also aware in my reading well, we have, of course, the Green Levy Fund Act, which is what is the source of funding for that particular Green Climate Fund. Of course, the country's current GCF portfolio of projects, the last time I understand up until of recent, it's valued at approximately 5.3 million US dollars, right? What I want to know is that, and then also added to which on November 1st, 2021, I understand that a Green Fund Advisory Committee was instituted by the ministry. On the point of taking ownership, what I want to know is what has been done thus far, or how has this advisory committee or the Green Fund itself, Climate Fund, been utilized, or what progress has the ministry made in granting funding to NGOs and NPOs from some of these communities that are affected, who may have projects in mind that could assist, even though it might be small scale projects. I personally believe, Chair, respectfully, drip, drip fills that bucket. And of course, this is an all hands on deck approach. So I want to know from the ministry, through you, Chair, with respect to access to that Green Climate Fund, in light of the fact that, of course, we're looking at a fund that has approximately 5.3 million US dollars in funding that, community groups, NPOs, NGOs can access. What progress has the ministry made, or that advisory committee made in approving projects that, come to the committee, that, of course, projects that can have, whether it's a small scale impact, but could nonetheless have an impact in dealing with the issue of climate change. Would the ministry be in a position to give us some information on, let's say, the key projects that are intended to be implemented for this upcoming fiscal, based on applications that have been made for that Green Fund, under that Green Fund? If the ministry could inform us which NGOs to date have been able to access funding under that Green Fund. Because of course, this, Chairman, respectfully, comes from the conversation of taking responsibility, ownership of what falls under, respective ministries and their purview. Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity.
Ms. Ramesa.
Thank you, Member, for the question. And through you, Chair, Mr. Kumarasan would like to make a comment first. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you, Member, for the question. I just wanted to clarify maybe one or two things in the question, and that's the distinction between the Green Climate Fund, which is an international multilateral fund that is a resource to provide funding for climate change action in developing countries, and the Green Fund, which is the which is national fund. But permit me to also mention that we also completed a project, and I thank the member for identifying the most important constituency, I would imagine, in climate change, and that's the community level. So we recognize that, and only recently we have implemented a training program, actually, for CSOs and NGOs in understanding environmental issues from an MEA perspective, including climate change, biodiversity, waste, and so on, and also building their capacity to write quality projects for funding under the Green Fund. So that's something that we had implemented a few years ago. But let me also quickly add that under the Green Climate Fund, which is the International Multilateral Fund, there is a programming called the Readiness Programming, which provides seed funding for training and capacity building among constituencies and countries to access funding. And we are in the process of implementing a few of those, one in agriculture. And it was only last week, actually, that we were in Tobago, meeting with NGOs and CSOs to build their capacity and their understanding of how they can develop projects, of how they can use their knowledge, how they can use their research where it may be applicable to develop quality concept notes and quality projects to access funding from the Green Climate Fund. So it's that training has been ongoing, and the objective, of course, is to build capacity. The Ministry of Planning and Development is the nationally designated authority for the Green Climate Fund, and we have continued engagement. And after this round of training, we have discussed with various NGOs, both in Trinidad and in Tobago, offering them continued assistance for developing concept notes, for helping them to identify some of the issues that they may have on the ground and may need addressing from a climate change perspective. So that's some of the efforts that we have been undertaking at the community and the NGO level, both from the multilateral fund called the Green Climate Fund, as well as from the national fund called the Green Fund. So it's two separate entities with two different approaches. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for that. And of course, perhaps it was the way in which I expressed it, but I do understand the distinction between the funds. On the point of the Green Fund, which of course is, a national funding. So thank you for, of course, your contribution. But, I want to know, because of course, this is funding that we have NGOs and NPOs that are applying for. And I'm glad to know that training, you all have embarked upon training for these NGOs and the necessary entities to understand so that they create projects, of course, that they can then be able to successfully access funding. Can you identify, though, based on the applications that have come before you, what seems to be some of the major challenges that these entities are facing in accessing funding? And the reason why I'm asking this is because, I had the benefit in a previous incarnation to serve on a board in which, persons would come to us for funding. And while sitting on that board, of course, sometimes constantly we have to reassess the criteria in which persons must satisfy in order to access funding, because of course sometimes we may set the target so high that a little community group in a little remote village who really want to plant vetiver grass may not be able to satisfy the standard. But when you look at it, they may be able to make a significant contribution in their little community. And that's why I come back to the drip, drip, fill in the bucket concept. Have the ministry, what are some of the challenges have you noted that these entities are facing in accessing the fund? And have you all, considered perhaps even reassessing, the criteria which must be satisfied for persons to access the Green Fund I'm talking about, specifically National Fund, so that we can encourage more NGOs and NPOs with the passion? Because, I respectfully believe that a lot of times why policies remain on paper is when it's not driven by people with passion to have it completed and implemented. And sometimes it's these little community groups that you have the passion to want these things implemented. So perhaps that's why I'm going down the line, of course, respectfully, Chair, through you, to find out, you know, apart from the challenges, if you all have considered even looking at the criteria that so that the fund can now be accessed by all these community groups who can play a critical part in the process. And Chair, after that is answered, that's the extent of my intervention.
Okay, back to you, Ms. Ramesa.
Thank you. Thank you, member, for the question and for the advice. Yes, the Green Fund Executing Unit is under the Ministry of Planning and Development, and we do have a list of ongoing projects. I agree with, and yes, there are criteria such as you have to be an NGO or a non-profit state entity to access funding. The NGOs and those entities that put forward proposals also, they must also have the capacity to implement, and they must demonstrate that they have the capacity to implement. And sometimes this may or may not be so. So I agree that there has to be some pooling of resources, or at least the capacities at the NGO level. And also I would like to add that the Ministry of the officers in the Green Fund unit, they work with NGOs to help them to develop projects. So yes, we admit that it could be done better, but they do go out and meet NGOs and help them along the process. In terms of the other challenges, if you would allow us, we would like to document this and forward it to you at a later date, and as well as the list of projects that you requested. We could provide a list of the ongoing projects, and if there are projects in the pipeline, we would be happy to do that as well. But if you would allow us to submit at another time, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Member Morris Julian, I haven't forgotten you with the question here that you had asked, but I would just push it down a little bit because
that's okay, Chairman.
Yeah.
Because through you, Chairman, I'm seeing that you definitely has something to contribute. They see their hands have been up.
Yeah, so I'm now going to, I was going to get to them because their hands have been up, Professor Michael and also Dr. Rupnarayan. So first we'll go to Professor Michael.
So thank you, Chair. I have been listening to the discussion, and I noted very early in the discussion the issue of governance and, you know, whether the mechanism for us to coordinate our approaches to dealing with disasters like flooding and so on could actually work through intersectoral committees or task forces and so on. I think, though, that there is an existing governance system that we can operationalize. There are some agencies that have the legislative authority to implement and enforce their policies and regulations. I draw a reference to the Town and Country Planning Division that has laws and regulations regarding limitations on hillside development. That has been around for a very, very long time. Perhaps there is some degree of inertia in operationalizing the actual regulations, because a lot of that hillside cutting is contributing to flooding in the area. There is the EMA, which has its own regulations, and it requires some enforcement capacity. No doubt the Drainage Division is pivotal in addressing some of the sedimentation in the river courses and so on. So there are many agencies that have existing legislation, and we do not really need to go the way of legislative reform. What we really need to focus on would really be the implementation and enforcement of those regulations. I wanted to also add that the UWI can make a contribution in terms of improving that science policy implementation nexus we do have the scientific data in some cases to inform the decision making. And I would advocate to call upon us where we can assist in that regard. And apart from the 2 points made about governance mechanisms and the need for enforcement, the third point that I wanted to raise was the fact that I think the culture of data sharing needs to be improved, because even as scientific researchers, we cannot actually conduct rigorous research and develop rigorous research outputs without data sharing from various governmental agencies. So I think that's an area that we do need to work on if we are going to see some impact on addressing the climate change impacts that we are facing. So that's my contribution. I know Dr. Rupnarine has been waiting to make his contribution as well. So I would like to invite him to also make his contribution, as you had indicated. Thanks, Chair.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor. We go to Dr. Rupnarine.
Thank you very much, Prof. and Chair. Colleagues, I listened to the conversation that we were having. And a lot of the issues that were raised is very much from an academic perspective, things that we have been concerned about, because I heard the concept of climate change being raised as a critical issue. And we are saying that based on the evidence of the last couple of, like last week and so on, that it is now concretized that all of these things are as a result of climate change. I just want to put a point across. If you examine the data in terms of the total rainfall for the month of November, there were many, many years in the past where the total rainfall was much higher. In fact, November's total, maybe from a few weather stations, it may be different in others, is not even in the top 15. So it is even more critical that we prepare for climate change, because what we are facing now is not necessarily anything out of the ordinary. What has happened is the intensity has changed. We could clearly see that you had a couple of days with excessive rainfall. But if we really examine what the consequences of climate change are, it's temperature increases, rainfall changes, possible drought, etc., which can be addressed without considering the long-term effects of climate change. These are things that are occurring right now. So the point I'm trying to make is we should not be looking at the projected increases, etc., by kind of deferring our responsibility from what is happening right now. And it may not, or it may be climate change, but the fact is infrastructural development is one of the critical issues that needs to be addressed because of the lack of regulation, the lack of planning, and the manner in which it is currently conducted. Further to that, we have to recognize nature-based solutions. That was not raised in any of the interventions that I would have heard being elucidated before. So perhaps things like green roofing, rainwater harvesting, underground stormwater storage, these are solutions that can happen very easily at the community level. So I just wanted to point out these critical factors, noting that what we are seeing now will only get worse. And it may not necessarily be because of climate change. It may actually be because of anthropogenic factors that we are, pushing aside. Because when you say climate change, it's almost like it's an act of God that we don't have any control over. And I beg to differ. I think we have lots of control over what is happening now. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Rupnarine, for bringing those points to our attention. I think we will be coming back to revisit some of the points you have raised a bit later down, or if not today, at this particular hearing, at another session that we'll have to schedule. Because yes, I agree with you. What we are seeing is just the beginning of it. We have seen tremendous adverse impacts throughout Europe, throughout North America, particularly in terms of wildfires and all of those things, landslides and all of those things. we are having a taste of it right now, and definitely going to intensify in the years to come.
Chair, with your permission, just one more point I wanted to raise, which I totally forgot. There's a national NDPPM through the ODPM, and I think since we're talking about preparedness in a sense and climate change, I was just wondering why.
Could you just please explain the acronym for the viewing public?
And the PPM is the National Prevention and Preparedness Month Committee. Yeah, National Disaster Prevention and Preparedness Month Committee. They meet on a monthly basis, and their duty is really to, look at all the disaster preparedness mechanisms that we have in place. And it has, I can't find the TOR right now, but there are members from various ministries as well as the ODPM. And there are a couple of activities that are going on through the UNDP, which is one, the community flood early warning systems that are being installed in some parts of the country right now. And I think, they could be that committee, or at least the findings of that committee or what they discuss could be very informative to the process going forward.
Yeah, the ODPM would be appearing before the committee at our next hearing.
Okay, great.
And yeah, we have requested from them in writing details of those respective programs. So thanks once again. Member Morris Julian, I'm going to put you on hold for a little more because it's going to shift the direction of the meeting that we are having right now.
No problem, Chairman. I appreciate where it's going.
Yeah, with the Ministry of Planning and Development and what is coming out of it. So what I'll do, I'll ask, at this stage, I'll ask Member Ibrahim to ask his questions, and then we'll come to you, Member Morris.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you, Chair. Staying with Ministry of Planning and Development, one thing and the overall topic that we are on, and as elucidated, climate change literally is not something in the future, but climate change is upon us, and we will constantly have to have measures to mitigate and to maneuver around it. Specifically the planning, what we've seen over the last few weeks to months is a lot of devastation and human hardship as it applies to high density locations and areas of dwelling. We also know the entire concepts when it comes to, and I'm sure the conversation will go on later on today, when it comes to the environmental groups, the EMA, the marine aspect of it as well, coastal development and so on. And specifically, in a broad aspect and in a broad questioning, I'm sure that the planning division through town and country planning may be able to answer this question, and what measures are being taken to integrate climate change adaptation in all development planning, not just in a area by area basis, but more so we know where floods. We're seeing new areas that are flooding. We know about the low-lying areas. The professor from the university just spoke about hillside development. However, directly up against that and opposed to that is development in low-lying areas. And linked towards that, with that, is also development in coastal erosion areas. I have a multi-pronged question here, and not only to find out the measures being taken to integrate climate change and adaptation in all development planning as a nationwide approach. Has there also ever been, and this is the second part of the question, has consideration been given to the establishment of no-build zones in certain low-lying areas and a relocation strategy for inhabitants in area with high susceptibility at inundation? I put this question to you, Chair, to the Ministry of Planning.
Thank you, member. I would like Mr. Pariak from the Town and Country Division to make a comment, please. Gary.
Good afternoon, members. With respect to, if I may be permitted to answer the second question first, certainly consideration can be given to the establishment of no-build zones in specific areas, but one can appreciate that data needs to be gathered in the first instance to assess the vulnerability of any given areas and the feasibility of any intervention would also need to be quantified in itself. The division in its execution of its land use policy would have specific zones where no built development is permitted or built development is restricted in a sense in spaces such as near the seismic areas and in Paro, if I could give an example. With respect to the first question, I would like to say that in both, well, the division executes functions in development planning and in development control. And elements of climate change adaptation and mitigation are captured in that evaluation process. Certainly, given what we have been seeing in the built environment and natural environment in the last few months is indicative of our considerations being a little inadequate and a need for them to be strengthened. And most certainly the division in its development control could deal with strengthening its monitoring efforts as well, because we would only be apprised of where unauthorized development is taking place based on public feedback and our contingent's ability to monitor the landscape.
To you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Pariag, for your concise answer. However, within your first, answering the second question first, although it was fine, I am sure it can actually lead back to where we were just speaking about, which is to get away from the silo concept. I am sure within this meeting right now, maybe through agriculture, maybe through the EMA, maybe through the IMA, these other institutions would very, very, very well be poised if allowed to integrate, Mr. Chairman, as a recommendation, feeding back into the recommendation that we were speaking about before, would definitely be able to, with a task force or with a focus group as a catalyst in moving forward for the betterment of the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, be able to lend information so as to speed up the process where we can have proper information on these matters in moving forward and in assisting the planning division moving forward. That is basically a comment. However, I would like to also bring up and raise, we had some floods in the East-West corridor in areas that never flooded before for 20, 30 years. Residents said a particular message. Then we had in the area a little more central to the East-West, which was the drain off into the Bamboo area, the Carney area. We had the same comments being made by residents and officials. And my question is to the planning division, but specifically to Mr. Pariag, as it applies to errant projects, errant contractors, errant practices of taking away waterways, drainage areas, encroachment upon areas that your department would definitely not have allowed. The enforcement aspect of it on your end, on a planning level, do you see it as adequate to be able to come in, stop, halt during the process of expansion or progress, taking back the land that people would have encroached upon, correcting the measures, or even enforcing to the point of fining and building up a criminal charge to errant developers who we have seen contribute significantly to the demise of many a community and many nationals of Trinidad and Tobago.
Thank you, Member. Mr. Faria.
Member, thank you so much for the question. Errant construction and unauthorized development, it is a very serious and urgent problem that members of the public typically look to TCPD as one agency responsible. TCPD is one agency responsible for dealing with errant construction, and we do so in conjunction with a number of other state agencies, inclusive of the municipal authorities and the EMA, who's also present. Our existing legislation, the Town and Country Planning Act, it does make provisions for dealing with development as defined that does not have the benefit of the grant of a planning permission. The new legislation as well, the Planning and Facilitation of Development Act, also makes serious provisions where action can be taken against development that does not have planning permission. In the current setting, the process is often seen as being a little tedious, but I can say that when undertaken with diligence, it is capable of producing good outcomes. And certainly we could expect that in the new legislative environment, those outcomes would just be of an increased efficiency. The real a part of the problem that is being experienced in Town and Country is, I'm very sorry to say, a critical staff shortage to deal with the high volume of matters that are generally brought to our attention. The TCPD has seen no increase in its manpower contingent since 1969, but the nation has been developing apace since that time. Our ability to monitor is something to speak to, and again, it's a shared responsibility with many other agencies, but my division is constrained by a contingent of 12 to deal with unauthorized development across the entire nation. There are other facets of the matter that constrain our ability to take action effectively and in a timely fashion. As I mentioned, the complaints and enforcement process is often seen to be tedious because this process culminates to a matter in the magistrate's court. It requires a robust investigation in the first instance, but more importantly, knowledge of the owner of the land on which the unauthorized development is taking place. And the division would rely normally on the ministry's legal services unit to undertake much of that particular facet of the investigation. Where the division is unable to find any information as it would relate to the owner of the land, we would normally be unable to carry forward any action in any particular instance of unauthorized development. And where our LSU is unable to assist in garnering that information, we would usually seek the services of an external search clerk. Now, given the volume of matters that are brought to our attention, funding becomes an issue, specifically later into the financial year. Unauthorized development on state lands and within the riparian boundaries are also a little problematic for us as well, in that how I was trained, the state would not normally take the state to court. Therefore, we investigate the matters of unauthorized development on the state lands, determine its legitimacy, and refer the matter to the relevant agency that may or may not be able to act. At that point of referral, I am generally unable to speak to the ability of these other agencies to execute their mandate with respect to the same dealing with unauthorized development.
Chair,
through you, just sticking to the last contribution by the Acting Director of Town and Country and Planning Division. And your points are noted. However, one of the major points that you stated at the beginning is the volume of claims, the volume of issues versus the lack of manpower. I think that is that strikes to the core of your ability to be able to execute your duties, because you did state once it is done properly and in a timely manner, you are effective in halting development that can capitulate the catastrophic effects of the climate change moving forward. I would like to just ask of you, sir, through Mr. Chair, what has held back and what do you see as the holding back? Because Trinidad and Tobago is definitely not a country where we have a lack of talent and resource when it comes to educated citizens. What is it at the core? What is it at the core, would you say, is the reason why you have such a small department and you call a year out from last century, 1969, where you have not been able to be staffed more? Can you elucidate what is your constraint here through you, Mr. Chair?
Thank you, member. Yes, the manpower shortage in the Town and Country Division is a very serious one. I don't want to seem as though I'm shifting blame, but the positions, when we have to fill them, we have to go through the Service Commission's department procedures. But I would hasten to add, though, that we recently had interviews for the positions of director and assistant director of the unit and some other officers in the unit as well. So we are awaiting responses from the Service Commission department. And I do acknowledge that the contingent of staff that Mr. Paria would like still may not be filled when those positions are filled. But we are trying to assist in Mr. Paria in that way. What I would like to add as well, while the Town and Country Division staff will go out and monitor sites, it would be very difficult for them to monitor the entire Trinidad and Tobago. So what we rely on as well is feedback and complaints from the public. And to the extent that persons are willing to do that, only then it comes to our attention, apart from our own site visits. So that would be another angle that we would want to look at if recommendations are being made. Thank you.
Chair,
Go ahead.
It would be a a great opportunity for me at this point in time to speak to some of the things that we have been doing to facilitate members of the public bringing these matters to our attention. I know I may not be making reference to climate change impacts when I speak to unauthorized development, but in sincerity, they are almost synonymous with each other by definition. And the division would have launched its digital platform recently, Develop TT. And on that platform, members of the public are given an opportunity to at least make these instances of unauthorized, or ask the question as to whether or not a development is authorized or unauthorized by the state. Effectively, through the Develop TT portal, one is able to submit a development complaint, and we queue them to be investigated accordingly.
That's it, Kerry?
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you, Kerry.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Parekh. Dr. Ruknarayan, I see you have your hand up.
Thank you very much, Chair. I just wanted to, given the resource constraints that were mentioned, I just wanted to raise a point that something that could be considered, as is done in, I think, Barbados, is that they, on a periodic basis, they utilize drone footage from remote sensing to examine the development, one, have a baseline, and then every couple of years, they redo it and check to see what has changed over time. It would negate the fact of having to wait for people to come and say, well, okay, this is going on. And one, it is less labor intensive. So maybe a consideration would be to include the technology. Yeah. Thanks.
Professor Michael?
Yes, I in fact wanted just to make that point that the drone technology, the unmanned aerial technology facilitates reconnaissance work and investigative work. That's the new technology, low-cost technology, simple to use, that's being used across the developing world. We certainly have a department at the UWI, my department of geomatics and engineering and land management, where they use the UAVs or the unmanned aerial vehicles or drones. And of course, they utilize satellite imagery, which can be downloaded almost free from the internet now through Google Earth and so on. And we can map new development over time. So I think the capability is there. It's just for the Town and Country Planning Division to mainstream the use of these digital technologies and platforms to inform their monitoring, their surveillance, and to execute their enforcement actions and so on. So there is, on a positive note, there are some changes taking place that are transformative in helping the division build capacity. And the expertise resides within UE for conducting training. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thank you very much for those inputs, Dr. Ruknarayan and Professor Michael. And I trust that the Town and Country Planning Division would take note of it and would consider it and probably approach you all to for some collaboration in that area. Before I come to Member Morris Julian, the question of the flooding, the East-West Corridor flooding. Before we move off from Town and Country Planning Division, in response to one of the questions that the committee had asked, question 25, regarding the importance of spatial planning to climate change adaptation. Mention is made in your response to Spatial Planning Guideline 18, because I think you outlined several guidelines that have been developed. And this particular guideline, Spatial Planning Guideline 18, titled Climate Change Adaptation Design Guidelines, has been developed by the Town and Country Planning Division. My question is, Is this guideline now being used as a basis for approval of new development? Mr. Ramisa or Mr. Pariag?
Thank you, Chair. Go ahead, Perry.
It is my understanding that the guideline is to be put out to the public for review and comment, and we will hope to augment the document accordingly based on that feedback. But certainly, the guidelines previously published also offer some insight with respect to the one specifically on climate change.
Go ahead.
I do believe we would hope to augment it even further and release it to the public for public consumption.
All right. Do you have a time frame for this or timeline?
I would like to believe at the beginning of first quarter of 2023.
Oh, okay. Would it be possible to provide this committee with a copy of that spatial planning guideline 18 that you have developed?
We will forward all that are published so far, inclusive of this one, where it isn't in the public realm as yet.
Okay, thank you very much. Member Morris Julian, we finally come to you eventually and to your question.
Thank you very much, Chairman, but I believe that Member Ibrahim already touched upon it. With regards to the same question, the flash flooding areas along the east-west corridor, it will be interesting to get a perspective, not just from planning, but also Ministry of Works and Transportation.
Okay, so could we ask the Ministry of Works and Transportation if they can respond specifically to the issue of the flash flooding, particularly along the east-west corridor areas?
Thank you, Chairman. The Director of Drainage will initiate the discussion.
And thank you for the question. As we have seen recently, the intensity of rainfall we have been getting is, as mentioned before, extremely intense and short duration in certain microcells and microbursts we have in specific areas. So when we get rainfall along the east-west corridor, especially, the increased development that we had in some places further uphill and also along the Eastern Main Road, we have seen a lot of our green spaces disappearing. We have seen not enough drainage put in where detention ponds should be. We have seen many illegal developments, I would say. I would go to that extent because some of them have not even received country planning approval in this instance. And our aged infrastructure along the east-west corridor is critical at this point in time because some of them were not designed to take this type of rainfall. And what we have been doing is trying to accommodate the excessive surface runoff that we have been getting. We have been making sure that our critical water courses along the east-west corridor have been clean, have been increased to take more capacity, and to ensure that the water doesn't stay on the roadway. You may see the flood come, and then it goes. Within an hour and a half, the most, the water goes. But then we have intense debris everywhere to be clean and clear. But we really have seen an intense increase, I would say, of the amount of water that's coming down, especially in the Aruga area. And that we have tracked to a lot of developments in the area. A lot of people are building way too close to the water courses and now taking away that critical reserve space that is designed to protect them. They have been taking that away, and now they are being heavily impacted when the water spills out of the existing drainage. But it would be remiss of me if I don't mention that some important work has been done in that area by the Pure units And we have seen a little bit less flooding in that area, especially just off of 5 Rivers, where they have done some culvert works to try to alleviate that water. But we have to make sure that the general consensus of ministries working together drives home. We need that cooperation. We need that enforcement by the local government arm, by town and country as well. And we need to improve our infrastructure, as noted before, that we have been trying to accommodate the excess water. But now we have increased that to do excessive rehabilitation works along East-West Corridor, along many parts of Trinidad, as you can see. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Through you, Chairman. Again, I think we're going right back to town and country.
Yes, it's because I think mention was made about the extensive developments that are taking place adjacent to water courses, very close to water courses, and I would believe that a lot of these developments are not approved developments, but they are unapproved developments. And in fact, we would have a fair amount of cases where you actually have buildings being constructed within the right-of-ways of a lot of our water courses as well, illegally as a matter of fact. Yeah, so it all comes back to the question of enforcement, monitoring, enforcement, and it's a gap that we are aware of, but it's being reinforced here by what is being discussed, and it brings it back up. It puts it back up very high on the agenda. That now coupled with the climate change, the impacts of climate change, it is definitively a problem that we have to address in terms of the unregulated developments, and the inability of the existing agencies through lack of staff, lack of manpower for proper enforcement. Because I think Professor Michael did indicate very early on, the legislation is there. It is a question of the enforcement. Professor Michael, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, Chair. In fact, I wanted to indicate as well, apart from the legislation and the plans where there are zones for no-build development and so on, and the hillside development policy restrictions. So there are things available that we can invoke at the moment. There is also the site development standards. What do site development standards mean in planning terms? It means that when someone applies to build on a parcel of land, the Town and Country Planning Division has regulations about how much of the site can be covered with a built structure. So it actually says specifically in its guide to developers that only so much of the site, 40%, let's say, in a hillside area can be covered by a concrete structure. The remaining 60% must be left under vegetative cover and so on. What has happened is that persons are overbuilding on the site. So you have a higher level of concretized surfacing, which leads to excessive and rapid surface water runoff, which then makes the drainage capacity reduce because the drainage infrastructure was never designed to cope with that level of runoff, which is what the drainage engineer was just saying. So to come back to the central point, there are existing regulations, standards, policies, and plans that simply need to be invoked. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We are facing a climate change crisis. Action is urgent. Look at the number of people who have been displaced by the flood events and landslides. And we need to look at what is available until the other reforms are brought on board. I do know Mr. Pariag noted that there was some initiative to revise the development regulations and so on, but there are existing ones that we can utilize without waiting. That's the key point. Urgent action is needed. Thank you, Chair.
So thank you very much, Professor Michael. And I do think it would be out of place for me to mention that at previous inquiries, when this entire thing came up of non-regulated developments, irregular developments, also the issue of squatting. There's also the fact of alleged corruption that is very high on the agenda with regards to developers and developments taking place, because you have developments getting approvals somehow or the other from the system, even though those developments should not be there at all because of where it's located. And that, but that's another issue in itself in terms of it. Mr. Pariag, you did mention about the Planning and Facilitation of Development Act, which is supposed to go very far in addressing a lot of these issues, putting a lot more emphasis on enforcement with regards to illegal development. But you know the challenge we have, because that law was passed in that bill was passed in 2014, and it is yet to be proclaimed. So, you know, the legislation was looked at to improve the situation, but we are challenged by getting that particular piece of legislation proclaimed. And that is something that the committee would be raising again under this particular inquiry. And it is not surprising, based on what we are discussing here, that there's a question from the public that has been sent to us. And the question is to Town and Country Planning Division. And I'll just read out the question, and if the Town and Country Planning Division would want to answer. But the question is being asked by a member from the public: on what grounds would Town and Country approve developments, including state-led developments, close to the bank of rivers, such as Greenvale and Rel Springs in Caroni? I don't know if Ms. Ramis or Mr. Pariag, you would want to address that question from the public.
Thank you, Chair. In the process of approving development, there are various levels of approvals. And in certain instances, relief is granted. But what was said earlier, in instances where information is not available, it is very difficult to predict what would happen. So in terms of being able to say that the Town and Country Division approves development in these areas, the Town and Country Division has certain regulations which it would approve, and there are instances where relief is granted based on the justification that is provided. But in these particular instances that were mentioned, if possible, we would like to give that in writing, but I would just answer the question in general. So there are levels of approvals based on the situation at hand.
Yes, ma'am.
Sure, and Mr. Parry, I would like to add as well.
Chair, in the grant of planning permission, we would seek to make sure that our decision is information-based, and in granting a planning permission that conforms or complies with our the elements in our evaluation, we would also refer the matter to the other subject matter experts in the other government agencies. What I have observed is that sometimes the system finds it difficult to assimilate a negative resolution. So where data suggests that something shouldn't happen, there's usually a lot of difficulty in accepting that decision.
Okay, Mr. President.
Chair, if I may respond to your earlier comment on the act. At present, we have established or constituted the National Planning Authority, and this entity would be responsible for taking the transformation forward and to any remaining pieces of legislation to fulfill those obligations. So I just wanted to add that piece.
Yeah, well, Mr. Minister, could you guide the committee as to, do you have a timeline for this, for getting this full proclamation being done?
A timeline for
having everything in place so that this act could be proclaimed?
No, I'm sorry, I can't give that at this time. If you would allow me to do some investigations and ask some questions to see if we can submit that information later. But the committee has just been constituted, just a couple of months old, a few months old. So we would have to find out if they've been able to put a time frame in mind for all of the things that need to be done.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now we have some other stakeholders here, the IMA, the EMA, the Ministry of Works and Transport. We have just engaged them only briefly. The Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries, not as yet. And time is running out on us. The committee thought that we would have gone through a lot more, but it seems as though we would like to close off this session no later than 5 p.m. We started a bit late, but I think it's inevitable that we have to have another hearing where we get back the stakeholders to a meeting, particularly where we can engage those that we have not engaged extensively in this meeting here today. Because out of necessity, and I think it was necessary, a lot of the discussions and questions have been focused with the Ministry of Planning and Development. But I see Dr. Rupnarayan, you have your hand up.
I feel like the colleagues from UE are talking quite a lot. So
but that's all right. We're happy about that.
I just wanted to ask a question though, in terms of the information, because I heard, I think, I can't remember who said it, but someone from the Ministry of Planning and Development indicated that there was, in some cases, there's missing information. And I was wondering what type of information is required for them to be in a better position to make these decisions. Because as I said, I said it on the chat, we have land use, we have soil type, we have vegetation, we have flood, we have drought, we have landslide susceptibility maps and risk maps. So I was wondering, from a research perspective as well, if there's a way that we could help in terms of the information that is required. We could probably assist in providing some additional information, or at least setting up something to acquire that information that would facilitate a better process going forward. I just wanted to raise that, Chair. Thank you.
All right, well, maybe what I'll do, I'll ask the Ministry of Planning and Development if they can respond to that in writing to the committee, what Dr. Rupnarayan is raising there, okay, in the interest of time, so that if you can take it into consideration and provide your answer to the committee in writing. And Dr. Rupnarayan, is quite okay that you all are making the interventions that you are making, because the committee felt that we would invite you to this hearing and also to all the subsequent hearings, because we we value the inputs that you all are making, and you know, we are happy about it. In the remaining time we have, I would just like to come back to the question about where, in response to one of the questions, the Ministry of Planning and Development, in response to how the challenges are being addressed with regards to particularly climate adaptation, and reference was made to the implementation and action plan that was developed based on the findings of the vulnerability and capacity assessment. And the ministry also went on to identify a strategic framework and program for climate change, risk management, which identify the roles and responsibilities of various ministries, departments, and agencies, or the MDAs, as they are being referred to. And the ministry has informed this committee that these plans were developed in 2020 to 2021. Now, I think Mr. Kumar Singh would have mentioned about the integration of these plans into the mandates of the respective ministries, departments, and agencies. And a significant challenge, he said, would be for the various MDAs to embrace the plans and implement them in the context of their individual roles and responsibilities. And the ministry went on to state that in this regard, a cabinet directive is being contemplated. Now, we did discuss that under governance and what are the possibilities coming out of it. But I know the time we have remaining is limited and the response may not be complete, but I would still like the EMA. We'll start with the EMA, and then if time allows, we'll go to the IMA, the Institute of Marine Affairs, and the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries, in that order, as to this, what the Ministry of Planning and Development is talking about in terms of strategic framework and program for climate change, and putting these into, integrating these into the mandate for climate change adaptation. And what, my question is, what challenges does it pose for you in terms of resources, in terms of organization, in terms of whether you have a legislative mandate to implement these plans that are being looked at by the Ministry of Planning and Development for integration within your mandate for climate change adaptation. So I'll go first, I'll ask the EMA if they can respond.
Thank you for that, Chairman, question, Chairman. So the EMA produced a strategic plan 2022 to 2026 this year, and the plan is now approved. And the theme of the plan is greater compliance for a greener future. And we have been working closely with our line ministry, the Ministry of Planning and Development, with respect to climate change and our strategic priorities with respect to climate change. And our strategic priorities come out of our, the Trinidad and Tobago's National Environmental Policy. And one of the priorities in our, that is Trinidad and Tobago National Environmental Policy, is addressing climate change and environmental and natural hazards. So in the work of the EMA, and one of the things that we would do is in terms of permitting, in terms of our certificate of environmental clearance, which developers or with some 44 designated activities will need to apply for an environmental permit. And in the assessments, we have included climate change requirements. For example, recently for the environmental impact assessment for the San Fernando waterfront, one of the requirements was that they submit to us a climate change adaptation plan. Another example, previously, with respect to drainage calculations, we would request 1 in 25 storm events. Today, we are requesting 1 in 50 and 1 in 100 storm events, based on the fact that these are, as the Ministry of Works was saying, these are the types of events that we're now experiencing in Trinidad and Tobago. And therefore the design, the engineering design needs to take in those events rather than how we did previously. As the MPD mentioned, Chairman, with the support of the MPD, we house the monitoring, reporting, and verification system for greenhouse gas emissions. So we have taken ownership of that, and we expect, as the Ministry of Planning has mentioned, that come the first quarter of 2023, based on the progress that we have made, that we will be able to submit at least the draft technical brief and legislation to the ministry for approval by cabinet, and hopefully in very close by we'll get public comments so that it could come in law as rules in 2023. With respect to the MRV, to give members a little bit more information, I'll ask Giselle Joseph to talk a little bit about the monitoring, reporting, and verification system.
Thank you, and thank you, Chair. As would have been indicated by the Ministry, the monitoring, reporting, and verification system was actually conceptualized by the Ministry and developed by the Ministry. The EMA would have been brought on as the entity to house the knowledge management system and basically implement with respect to GHG reporting and inventorying. It started with a pilot, I believe in 2018, and then from the pilot, the participants in the pilot were invited to start voluntarily submitting data. And from there, we started inviting additional entities to participate in the monitoring, reporting, and verification system. To date, we have 20 confirmed participants, and we've also recently issued additional invitations to 35 other entities. So far, the entities are across various sectors, but mainly in the energy and the industrial product use sectors are the ones that are stepping up and volunteering to participate. But it is, of course, on a voluntary basis. We do conduct training for these entities once they agree to participate, to help them in terms of collating and developing their inventories to submission. Once they submit the inventories through this system, it's an online digital system, we will do the actual data checks, validation, quality assurance. That will help the information withstand scrutiny, because of course this information is used for our reporting purposes. Outside of the GHG emissions, mitigation measures and adaptation measures are also required to be reported. But at this time, because it is voluntary and it's still in the early stages of implementation, a lot of that data is still to be submitted. So we have been working within the constraints that we have to get voluntary participation, and persons are coming on board slowly, but with the legislation which will mandate the reporting, we expect that that will become increased once the law is passed. So that's where we are right now with the implementation of the MRV, and we continue to work with stakeholders to get them on board and participating.
Thank you. Thank you, Giselle. So Chair, I know members were concerned about public awareness, public education, and the involvement of NGOs, NPOs, CBOs. So one of the things that we are doing with the Ministry of Planning and Development is that we, the EMA, is the national focal point for action for climate empowerment, ACE. And the ACE is a term adopted by the UNFCCC, which is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, to denote work under Article 6 of the Convention and Article 12 of the Paris Agreement. The overall goal of ACE is to empower, educate, and engage all members of society to take action to reduce the negative effects of climate change. And Xiomara Chin, my colleague, will, just give you and the members a little bit more information on ACE. Thank you, Xiomara.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman and members of the JSC. So ACE, the Action for Climate Empowerment, this is under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, as well as the Paris Agreement. It focuses on 6 elements, as Hayden would have said. It focuses on education, training, public awareness and participation, as well as, very critically, access to information, as well as looking at international cooperation. And these are all related to climate change. And so for Trinidad and Tobago and for the EMA as a national focal point for ACE, we have been focusing on, in the first instance, sensitizing persons, stakeholder groups about ACE, what it is, what it is intending to do, and to try and develop an action plan for implementation of ACE. And so we have been engaging with stakeholder groups over the last year or so. That work will continue in 2023 and beyond. And then part of that engagement process also looked at and took stock of what work is being done by all of these various stakeholder groups towards ACE and towards informing climate change actions. And one of the things that we are also doing is really trying to establish that whole communication pathway. So that's just a little bit about ACE, and it is a work in progress, and we are working towards really developing an action plan to fully implement it. Thank you.
So, Chair, one of the members mentioned the Green Climate Fund. And again, we're very happy to advise that through the National Designated Authority, which is the Ministry of Planning and Development, the EMA is in the process of getting accreditation as a direct access entity. And Nisha Ramsahai will tell us a little bit about this accreditation, this Green Climate Fund accreditation.
I would just ask Ms. Ramsay if you could be very brief, just maybe about a minute and a half, because we have to wrap up. But as I said, the opportunity would be there to get some more details at the next hearing. But Ms. Ramsay?
Yeah, certainly. So as part of our initiative to gain the status of National Direct Access Entity, the EMA would have gotten the blessings of the National Designated Authority in 2017 to approach the Green Climate Fund. We have been able to get our first readiness support grant, which would have allowed us to identify the gaps that we need to fill in preparation for the submission of our application to the GCF. That was completed in 2018 through the help of PricewaterhouseCoopers. Based on the findings of that result, of that study, we were able to identify the gaps, the critical gaps, the key gaps, and through a second readiness fund, we were able to partner with the 5Cs, the Caribbean Climate Change Community Center, as our delivery partner to close those gaps. In fact, just last week, we were able to deliver on the last of those 4 gaps. And this project with the Pisces, our second readiness fund, to close those gaps is due to close at the end of December this year, 2022. After that, we are going to focus our efforts in 2023 to gather the evidence that will support our application to the Green Climate Fund. It is our intention and our hope that by the end of 2023, we should be able to submit our application to the GCF and do hope for a favorable outcome. That will basically give us the status as a national direct access entity, which means any organization, any group, individuals can approach the EMA to be their delivery partner, which is where we're going to help persons turn concepts into action, and then assist with the application of the preparation of the funding proposal, which will go forward to the Green Climate Fund. So we are basically in, probably about midway in our accreditation journey.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Romano. Sorry to
no problem, Chair. Next time, Annalisa will share some of the projects that we're doing and how we've incorporated climate change in our projects. So we look forward to the next opportunity.
Yeah, and I assure you the opportunity would be there, and I'm sure member Sagar Singh Sukal would have been happy to hear that the EMA is seeking to be accredited. Yeah, because based on the concerns she had raised about the engagement of NGOs, community groups, and the ability to access that green fund with the least amount of hassle as possible. To all the other stakeholders who are here, who we have not engaged in any meaningful way, the IMA, the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries, the Ministry of Works and Transport. I want to assure you as chairman of this committee that we are definitely going to engage you in the next public hearing that we have scheduled for January 11th, 2023 at 1:30 p.m. Our secretariat will be in contact with you, and if there may be some further questions coming out of the discussions that we have had today that you will be asked to respond to prior to that January 11th, 2023 second hearing that we'll be having. So I just want to assure you that we definitely would intend to engage you a lot more meaningfully than we did today. At this point, I would just like to invite very, very brief closing comments from the Ministry of Planning and Development, and who we have engaged considerably today, and and also from the University of the West Indies. Just these two stakeholders for brief closing comments before we close. So we go first with the University of the West Indies, Professor Michael.
Sorry, Chair, Prof. Michael had to leave for another engagement, so she asked me to provide the closing remarks on our behalf.
Yeah, please proceed.
Well, I keep it short, noting the time. So we just want to thank you all for inviting us to participate. We definitely think that the University of the West Indies has a critical role to inform, all the information gaps, support and capacity building in this process going forward. And I think one of the critical issues that we have to look at is nature-based solutions and looking at ways of, not just regulating what already is there, but providing incentives for persons to do things in a manner that is more, in line with ecological and nature-based solutions going forward. Because we can't stop development per se, but we can try to do it in a sustainable, environmentally friendly manner. So thank you on behalf of the University of the West Indies, and we look forward to any further engagement.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Rupnarain. Ms. Ramesa, brief closing remarks.
Chair, I just want to say thank you to yourself and the members of the committee for your questions and your insight, and also to thank the team here at the Ministry of Planning and Development and everyone who made an input this evening. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to thank all representatives here from all the entities who were present. And in addition to the thanks that I extend, I want to expend our appreciation on behalf of the committee to the very detailed responses that you provided to the committee via your responses to the questions that were sent to you by the committee. I think the responses showed a lot of effort on your part. You were very thorough in your responses, and the committee is very much encouraged and appreciative of the efforts that everyone have made to give these detailed responses. I would also like to thank our viewing and listening audience. And I would like to thank the members of the committee for today's session, and to thank the staff of the Parliament, of the Secretariat to this committee, led by our Secretary, Mr. Johnson Greenwich, Assistant Secretary, Ms. Sholana Ramdeen, our Research Officer, Ms. Katrina Gokul, to thank them very much for their hard work throughout the period, and to wish everyone, all representatives, the viewing and listening audience, committee members, and the staff of the Parliament, a very joyous Christmas season. May we extend it's a season of goodwill to all, and may we share in this very joyous occasion. So thank you very much, and I declare this meeting adjourned.